Good morning to you all. Thank you for attending our webinar covering such an important topic at such a critical time. So we are covering keeping data safe and secure while remote, particularly during COVID-19. So a little bit about us. So my name is Ian Sutcliffe. I'm a director of Valentis Advisory. I'm an insurance professional of 30 years, and we provide support to businesses operating in the insurance risk and claims management sector. I'm presenting today with colleagues from the Copsll Group. So we have Rob Spiegelhalter, Chris Bester, and Jamie Beardsworth. I'll just pass to Rob and give you a little bit of background to himself, and we'll go through to Chris and Jamie from there. So Rob.
Yeah, thanks Ian. Hello everybody. So I'm working within the business development area for the Copswold Group and consulting. And previously I've been working in the counter fraud area. So I was head of fraud at NFU Mutual for 8 years, and prior to that cooperative insurance, but I've always worked in claims and counter fraud and business development focus now for me.
Thanks Rob. And Chris?
Hello everyone, my name's Chris Bester. I've been looking after all things IT for the Copsll Group for the last 8 years. Previously I worked as a IT consultant, implementing a wide range of technology solutions to address operational issues and drive efficiencies. Thank you.
And Jamie.
Hello everyone, my name is Jamie Beardsworth. I've always worked in insurance investigation. I joined the Cotswold Group in 2018, now head of data and intelligence for the Cotswold Group. So the Cotswold Group has a few tech products that fall under my remit, and I also look after a team of 40 intelligence analysts for the Cotswold Group. Thank you.
Thanks guys. Now we don't just plan to talk at you for the next sort of 45 minutes or so. We'd like to take questions as we go through the session, so please feel free to raise them using the chat function. If you're happy to for your name to be shown alongside your question, then just pick everyone on the chat function. If you want to remain anonymous, please just pick my name, so Ian Sutcliffe, and that question will just come through to me and I'll raise it anonymously. We are going to have question breaks at a couple of points throughout the presentation so that we can answer questions relevant to certain sections, if that's okay. So raise them at any time, and I'll pull the questions out at the relevant section break and we can answer them then. So that'll be great, thank you. A couple of other housekeeping rules. So all delegates will have no video and will be on mute, and that's to protect the internet quality. When I'm not talking or any of the other guys aren't talking or presenting, we're going to turn our video and voice off as well, so you'll only see the person presenting. We quite like the fact that you're able to see the whites of their eyes while they're presenting. So that's that. If there are any other questions as we go through, as I say, please just raise them through the chat function. So before we start, I just want to say thank you to the MGAA for supporting this presentation, this event. I've worked closely with them over the past couple of years. I know that they're working hard to deliver presentations that are practically useful for you as members, and we hope this one will be too. The association will be running a survey after the event as well, so if you could please take time to respond, as let us know what you liked, what we can improve and what we can do differently. That would be really useful, so thank you very much. I will now just briefly run through the key learning outcomes. So as a delegate attending the session, you should be able to better understand the risks when handling data when working remotely during the COVID-19 crisis. That will of course be entirely relevant as the crisis subsides and you probably begin to work more remotely or have more people working remotely. I know we've got some astonishing stats about the number of remote workers compared to prior to the crisis a little later on in the presentation. And I think, personally, I think that we will maintain a lot of remote working going forward, regardless anyway. You'll also be with knowledge and understanding about strategies and risks and to protect reputation, and understand some of the solutions implemented in the insurance investigation world to maintain confidentiality and data security. So I'm going to pass over to Rob Spiegelhalter, who's going to begin the detail of the presentation. So thank you very much. Over to you, Rob.
Excellent, many thanks, Ian. Yeah, first of all from me, on behalf of the Copsll Group, thank you to MGAA for letting us present with Valentis today. It's a really great opportunity for us to engage with your network, and I really hope that the session's useful for you today. Just first of all, some very brief information about the Copsll Group. So we were founded in 1990 as a small private investigation company, investigating insurance claims, and of course 30 years on, combined with G4S, who bought the Copsll Group in 2011, it's now the largest sort of specialist insurance investigation firm globally when you include that network. We've got a fully employed staffing operating model. We feel that's really essential because of the sensitivities of what we do, and it enables us to really keep a close guidance and control really of our people who deliver, you know, that service and quality and the standards that are required. So we get about 50,000 instructions per annum on claims and investigation services, and we have quite a wide client base, receiving most instructions from insurers, agents, third-party administrators and lawyers. So you'll hear a little bit about the technology that we use specifically around security, but generally we like to keep up to date with the technology to ensure fast movement of information and data from the field or desk back into our systems, which our clients have got access to, and therefore, you know, to clients. So getting really fast information back. That really pushes unnecessary sort of manual intervention when you've got technology to help you with that, and of course it keeps the costs down. As you would expect, we have very secure networks. Examples of the type of data that we manage would be video files from covert surveillance, electronic statements and documents and reports, and we do handle quite large intelligence data sets too. So keeping data safe and secure is fundamental to us and our business, and of course paramount to our clients. So I won't go into any more detail about the Cotswold Group. I just wanted to give you some context, but if you'd like to know more, don't hesitate to contact me or one of the team. Next slide, Ian, please, if you'd move on. Excellent. So a quick look at the agenda. So this is what we're going to cover. We'll share some insights into the way COVID-19 has significantly changed how we operate and the new risks that we face in business. We'll focus on three things. So first, we're going to set out what we think are the key risks and challenges with data security, but with specific reference to the remote working arrangements that are in place now. Second, we'll share some general strategies and solutions to keep data safe and secure. And third, we'll share some technologies aimed specifically at data security in our world of insurance claims investigation and claims handling. So personally, I'm going to set some context around the environment that we're in and highlight the challenges, and then I'm going to hand over to Jamie and Chris, who have the technical expertise in this area, to share some insight into the expected standards that are in place and what's expected, the risks and some technical solutions as well. So I hope that's good. We're going to be sticking closely to our material, so we keep to the agenda and also keep us on track with time. Next slide, Ian, please. So what are we faced with at the moment? You'll all know very well indeed. Let me just set that little bit of context. So a really mad and worrying time. And as we all know, this pandemic has really changed our lives completely. It's a crisis from many angles, and for most of us it's turned our private and working lives completely upside down. With the government restrictions and the imposition of social distancing and isolation, it's meant that most companies have had to work very differently indeed. So we're seeing some companies closing, scaling down, or trying to operate in a completely different way with their workforce at home. And it's clear companies are really fighting for their lives and desperate to stay afloat. And that means that they're reforming, they're changing activities, but importantly for today, creating new data networks and setting new ways of moving data around their businesses. So I know Ian's mentioned already, but home working is now the norm. I think we've got there are around 4 million people working from home before the virus. Now there's an estimated 30 million people. So huge increase. Another 26 million people working from lounges and kitchens, and if you're lucky enough to have a study or office, that's great, but completely different. And that brings new challenges with it, and of course, some significant data security risks. So the home working change has meant that company data is now streaming through new networks and devices. Companies have had to resort to using personal mobiles, tablets, laptops and PCs in some cases, and even changing to using a work device from home has brought significant challenges for IT teams across the UK, and no doubt some company standards have been relaxed temporarily to ensure companies can continue business. People are finding new ways of working too, including huge increases in the use of video and telephone conferencing, but video in particular, all to keep businesses going and to keep socially connected. Zoom have reported increases in peak daily participant use from 10 million in December 2019 to 300 million in April 2020. The numbers, of course, include personal use, but it's a sign of the changing working habits. So what does this do? This all creates an environment ripe for data breach, leading to reputational damage and financial loss, unless those risks that come with that change are managed really well. And the good news is that with the right knowledge, systems and approach, these systems risks can all be mitigated. So let's have a quick look at a very public issue to emphasise our challenge. Ian, if you'd move on, please. So as an example of what can happen to the best of us, you may remember the controversy surrounding Boris Johnson in early April for using Zoom to run a cabinet meeting. So this slide shows a copy of the image from his tweet. And what Boris was trying to do here was show the world how his cabinet was social distancing by using video conferencing. But it backfired when his tweet showed the panel of attendees all nicely at distance, nice bookcases and pictures, etc. But inadvertently, the meeting link was clear in the top left-hand corner of the screenshot. So there was a huge public fuss about how Boris and those that protect the government could be so naive and with the level of privacy and security adopted. The government and Zoom defended their position, but many organisations were highly critical of them and Zoom. The US government, Google, SpaceX, NASA, and lots of companies really weighed in with criticism about Boris and Zoom security and generally, but the BBC ran a list of flaws in the Zoom infrastructure too. So Zoom, as an example, are frantically trying to improve security and are pushing out upgrades and messages to users whilst they fill the security gaps. And other systems like Microsoft Teams and conferencing apps via Apple Macs have flaws, and everyone's trying to secure those gaps and make them 100%, if that's possible, 100% secure. I guess the irony is we're using Zoom conferencing today for this webinar, and I'm sure it's all very secure. I'll leave that one with Ben and Ian to manage, and there's nothing too controversial here today in any event. But it's an example of one of the challenges we face in this new world we're operating in. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jamie, who will cover data security standards and some of the key risks that we all face. So over to you, Jamie, and Ian, if you'd move the next slide on, please, for Jamie.
Thank you, Rob. So with the gargantuan rise in home working during COVID and companies being under severe pressure to remain operational, adhering to the data security standards can pose challenges, but adherence during these unprecedented times should not be overlooked. Now, I don't intend to discuss the specific requirements of the various data security standards in detail today, but the key point that needs to be emphasised here is that all data security standards that were applicable pre-COVID-19 invariably remain in place during COVID-19. The Information Commissioner's Office in COVID-related guidance has made it very clear that whilst GDPR and the associated UK Data Protection Act doesn't prevent home working, companies must consider the same kinds of security measures for home working that would be applied in normal circumstances. This means that personal data should still be protected in transit and at rest, whether it is in hard copy or digital. It means that endpoints such as PCs and laptops, whether personal or company issued, should have adequate protection against malware, antivirus, and the web. It also means that all devices should be password protected with a screen lock after a set period. With regard to ISO or similar forms of accreditation, again, the same pre-COVID standards need to be complied with, and COVID is not a valid excuse for a more vulnerable information security management system. With remote working and infrastructures completely changed during COVID, data breaches will be more difficult to detect. Whilst the ICO have advised that they may take a more empathetic approach during COVID in certain cases, they have made it clear that companies still only have 72 hours to report a data breach. They've also advised that they will come down hard on any company relying on COVID circumstances to justify or excuse their position in the event of non-compliance. So having discussed the circumstances we find ourselves operating in and some of the challenges faced, let's move on to the next slide so that I can discuss the top data risks associated with remote working. Thank you, Ian. So relaxed security measures to facilitate remote working can in turn give rise to both data loss and data leakage. These relaxed security measures can be as a result of systems not being maintained to the usual standards while many employees are furloughed or working in isolation. Many organisations will also have applied temporary measures to their systems or network firewalls in order for staff to work remotely. This lessened security, however, may lead to the systems being compromised. There may also be no or inadequate patch management of the end user's devices, rendering the devices susceptible to malware and viruses, which can ultimately lead to data loss and data leakage. So on to data loss. Inadequate or no malware protection as a result of relaxed security measures can leave a device susceptible to ransomware infection, a form of data loss. Ransomware usually encrypts all the content on the device's hard drive, and in some cases also content on network servers that is accessible from the infected device, and you are then requested to pay a ransom in order to have the content decrypted. Depending on how applications are accessed during remote working, company data might be stored on a company or personal device itself, which can also result in data loss. The device, for example, might have insufficient or no backup in place, and if the device gets lost, stolen, broken, or an application crashes, data loss can occur. With regard to data leakage, relaxed security measures can also cause data leakage, which is where data ends up in the possession of an unauthorized entity. As a result of increased remote working, hard copies that contain personal data are more likely to go in the normal waste bin instead of being securely disposed of, which can lead to data falling into the wrong hands. When there is inadequate malware, antivirus or web protection as a result of relaxed security measures, systems may be compromised, which again can lead to data falling into the wrong hands. When there are no data leakage prevention solutions in place, there is also a big risk that company confidential or personal information will end up on solutions that are in breach of GDPR or contractual requirements. For example, with personal cloud storage solutions such as OneDrive or Dropbox, the data you upload to these storage devices is usually stored in the United States and not in the European Union. Again, company data might end up on personal email services such as Outlook, Gmail and iCloud, which is stored in the United States. As a final example, increased use of video conferencing solutions without sufficient due diligence on the platform being used can lead to data being stored outside of the EU. Zoom, for example, were found to have routed data to China. Now, during the next slide, we can start discussing how we can ensure, as far as possible, that data is kept safe and secure during remote working. But before that, I'll hand over to Ian for any questions at this stage.
Thanks, Jamie. So I've got a couple of questions I think relate to this this section. Rob, perhaps you could direct them to the right person within the Cotswold Group. So Zoom and other conferencing systems are essential tools at the moment. Can any of them be 100% secure? I think I'll just add that I was on a webinar yesterday about video facilities, and some organisations, certainly in the insurance sector, are also using things like WhatsApp video and that kind of thing. So I think it goes beyond Zoom. But so I suppose the question is, can any of them be 100% secure, and whose responsibility is it to make sure they are? I think is probably the question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ian. So I'm going to let Chris answer the question from a technical point of view, but my knowledge is that none of them can be 100% secure, but some are much more secure than others. And of course, it's your responsibility, if you're operating those systems and using them, to make sure that they do comply and they are secure. So Chris, give me your and the group's insight into that, would you?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. Yeah, I don't think any system can be 100% secure. Obviously, there's various things you can do to ensure it's got a good level of protection. So I'm sure the likes of Zoom and Google Meet, etc., they've obviously got a bounty system where they would reward people that manage to find vulnerabilities in their systems. They might even conduct their own testing or ask third parties to perform security testing. But of course, at the end of the day, it is your risk. So as long as you do adequate due diligence and assess the risk in passing that particular file or data set onto that platform, then yeah, that should be efficient. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. And one more question for this section, I think. It looks like there are a combination of system and people risks with remote working. Are they as important as each other, or is one more important than the other?
Yeah, so I think you've got equal risk there coming through. And I think you know, systems vulnerabilities will cause similar damage to people risks. So if systems aren't secure enough, data leakage, data loss will occur, for example. And in the same way that that people can end up losing data or not keeping things secure. So I think it's an equal balance. One isn't as important as the other. They're absolutely both important.
I suppose it's also a balance between time and money for the business. So the business needs to decide how much risk they want to take. Of course, there are requirements set out in law, but beyond complying with those, then it becomes a business risk balancing act as well, doesn't it? Which I think we cover a little bit later anyway.
Yeah, we do cover some of that, but no, absolutely. And let's bear in mind here that some very small businesses, people that don't have big IT teams and big support networks, are having to manage these things. But all businesses are all having to weigh up what your risk appetite is, what you're prepared to do, what you're prepared to invest, and work through a priority list.
Yeah, okay. Great. So I will move on. Thank you for those questions. And if anybody has any other questions as we go through, please feel free to ask them. So I think back to you, Jamie, is it for the next slide?
Completely, yep. Thank you, Ian. So keeping data secure. So how do we go about doing that? Well, educating employees is vital. So most information security risks can be massively reduced if employees know what to look out for and what is not acceptable. All employees should receive information security training, particularly during COVID, in order to ensure they understand the risks. For example, how to identify phishing attempts, spam emails and texts, and unsafe web pages. Organisations can set up their own training or use a reputable third-party company to ensure the training is of a good standard. An information security and acceptable use policy is also vital. So organisations should have a robust information security and acceptable use policy, taking all their contractual requirements into account. The policy, which should be read and signed by employees, will again help them understand what is acceptable from an information technology point of view and ensure that employees do not inadvertently compromise any company data. Finally, remote devices should be secure. So generally, better security is achieved when work activities are undertaken on a work device and personal activities are restricted to employee-owned devices. As such, permitting employees to work on their personal devices is generally unwise, as cybersecurity is significantly weakened and breaches increase when you mix personal and business devices and usage. So ideally, employees working remotely should be provided with company-owned and secure devices, restricting their usage to work-related activities. That said, personal devices can sometimes be used securely for work-related activities, as long as remote app solutions are utilised. And my colleague Chris will elaborate on this further during this presentation. So whether a personal device or company device is being used, the following should be in place as a minimum and will greatly reduce information security risks. So a good antivirus and malware solution should be in place that keeps itself up to date at least once a day. There should be full disk encryption. Device encryption is included of all versions of Windows 10 and should be enabled. Firewall is included on later versions of the Apple Mac operating system and should be enabled, and Chrome OS is encrypted by default. An employee's user account should not have administrative access to the operating system. The operating system and web browser updates should be installed as soon as possible when they become available. A password protected screen lock should be in place that automatically locks the screen after 5 minutes or less of inactivity. The local device firewall should be enabled. And we would also recommend adding a web protection solution such as Cisco Umbrella or Mimecast Web Security, as these solutions will protect your device when browsing the web, but also restrict access to online services that are against the organisation's acceptable use policy. So now if we can move over to the next slide, please, and I'll hand over to my colleague Chris, who will discuss keeping data safe and secure while working remotely in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. So home working brings a new set of challenges, especially when everyone has to adapt quickly like we had to. When we first saw countries like Italy and Spain introducing lockdown measures in the beginning of March, I think we all knew it would only be a matter of time before the UK had to introduce similar measures. And on the 23rd of March, Boris Johnson announced the UK will go into lockdown as well. This did give IT teams in the UK some time to prepare, although some companies might have waited to introduce remote working capability at the last minute. So here we are, you have been issued with some IT kit, whether a laptop, PC, mobile phone, etc., and you are expected to work from home. Some employees might have used their own IT equipment and might even have to go out and buy some kit at the last minute, which was a challenge in itself with the demand for IT equipment increasing. A lot of us might not have the luxury of a spare room where we can work from. Employees might now have to spend all day in their living room or at their kitchen table working away. This can mean that screens, documents and work-related conversations can become available to family members and other cohabitants. So staff will need guidance on how to organize their work and the risks associated with the data they handle. The guidance can be included in your acceptable use policy, or a home working policy can be set up for this. Home working risks should be covered during information security training, covering topics such as being aware of your surroundings when using video conferencing and making sure you close documents and browser windows not required when sharing your screen. Reducing and even eliminating the use of paper will greatly reduce the risk of data loss and data leakage. There are also challenges around connectivity as well. Employees have now been moved from a secure office environment with enterprise-grade firewalls and dedicated fast internet connections to their homes with a wide range of different networks and connectivity, which will also be shared with cohabitants and family members. Applications might run slower because of it, which can be frustrating for users. Connectivity to your organization's applications can be over the web or traditional VPN. It is important to remember that with any remote access, a hacker will look to steal passwords that enable them to connect to their information systems. Therefore, you should always try and implement two-factor or multi-factor remote access solutions where possible. If multi-factor authentication is not enabled, then your network will only be secure as the weakest password in your organization. Applications that is accessible over the web should be protected by SSL web certificate. If possible, restricted to trusted IP addresses or regions. Require unique credentials, ideally with multi-factor authentication, and regular vulnerability assessments or penetration testing should be carried out on web applications, especially if they are publicly accessible. High and medium vulnerabilities found during these tests should also be remediated as soon as possible. Depending on how risk-averse your organization is, they might have accepted temporary risks in order to give everyone home working capability. The use of personal devices is fine as long as there are segregation between personal and business environments. Arguably, the best way to achieve segregation currently is by using remote web app environments such as Microsoft Web Apps or Citrix Workspace. These solutions allow you to use personal devices, but only in order to access your work environment over the web, keeping your data completely separate, keeping your work data completely separate from your personal data. If you are forced to introduce new internet-facing services to facilitate remote working, then they must be tested. If you cannot do this prior to rollout, which is understandable in an emergency, then don't use this as a reason never to test them. Aim to test all emergency changes in the shortest time frame possible to ensure you haven't inadvertently created a security breach. Remember, over the last 2 years, over 80% of incident response callouts have been related to cloud projects, where people introduce new vulnerabilities by enabling new internet-facing services without them being tested. Users, particularly when isolated at home, will need to be given enhanced support to understand the risks that are under their control, particularly with regard to phishing. Now, as already mentioned by Jamie, more than ever, you will need to test your users regularly and give them targeted training to spot and report phishing. Zscaler, a popular cloud security solution, reported seeing an increase of 30,000% in phishing, malicious websites and malware targeting remote users, all related to the COVID-19 since January 2020. You will also need to ensure that your home working environment is covered by your current breach detection and response systems, as these users are increasingly likely to cause a breach. It is essential that their activities are logged and monitored for evidence of a breach. If this cannot be done immediately, then like any new system testing, it will need to be done as soon as practical. Next slide, please. This brings us on to video data. Video conferencing services such as Zoom that we're using today, WebEx, GoToMeeting, etc. are no different than any other online service provider. If they're processing any personal data for your use of the service, they will be your data processor. And in GDPR terms, that means you need to be sure they are GDPR compliant and that there is a contract in place with regard to the processing of that personal data. And yes, that includes when you have a team meeting or invite people to an online discussion via the service. When choosing a video conferencing solution, functionality, reliability and stability is important, but these considerations should also be taken into account before making the final decision. Video conference software. In order to use the solution, do you have to install an application and does it require administrative rights? One of the pitfalls of many video conferencing solutions is that the end users need to install software on their device, and it often requires administrative rights. Depending on the end user's environment, they might not have the necessary permission to do this, which means they won't be able to join your conference. Where is the solution hosted? And are they GDPR compliant? As part of your due diligence on the provider, review their privacy policy and GDPR statements, paying special attention to how they store recordings and personal data, what they use personal data for. There is a good chance that the service provider will process data outside the EU, so you have to make sure there are protections in place in line with GDPR. When subscribing to the provider of choice, make sure you sign a data processing agreement that meets the requirements set out in Article 28 of GDPR. It is also highly recommended to set up a privacy policy that can be shared with all meeting attendees every time someone in your organization hosts a meeting. Within the privacy policy, mention how you plan on using any registration data, chat information, recordings, transcripts, attendee lists, etc. you will be processing from the sessions. This is a GDPR required and the right to be informed. As part of this process, you will have to reference your provider's privacy policy in terms of how they use personal data and when you host a call. Also, review your provider's cookie policy and mention that attendees can adjust their cookie settings to require cookies only, which will limit advertising cookies. If you plan on recording the session, you should make it clear to attendees that this will be happening and what you plan on doing with the recordings and transcripts. For example, when they turn on their camera, the image will be available for everyone in attendance. Depending on how they set up their account, their name, email address, etc. may be available to other attendees. What they say will be recorded. Also be clear that if they screen share or discussing confidential information, that this too will be retained as part of the recording. To make this process easier, you may add all this information to your privacy policy and simply include a link to your privacy policy on all meeting invitations. We will now go into another question break. Ian, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so I have a question that's come through here in with reference to acceptable use policy and how frequently an acceptable use policy should be updated. I suspect the first answer to that question, Rob, is if it didn't include remote working before this crisis, it should certainly be updated now to include remote working, but also just how frequently should businesses be looking at it going forward?
Yeah, correct. So, Chris, you manage our acceptable use policy. Do you want to give an idea on what we do and what the standards are?
Yeah, so according to ISO 27001, you'll have you have to specify certain risk triggers. So things that might happen that then allows you to, assess that risk again, and as part of that process, update your policies accordingly. So things, usually it's things like when you have a new contract or a new service, or you have a major system change, and certainly things like COVID-19 will be one of those triggers. So as a general rule, policies should be updated once a year, although they can also all be updated within the 3-year life cycle of your ISO framework. But certainly when there's major changes to your business, new services, things like COVID-19, then at that point risk should be reassessed and policies should be updated accordingly.
Thanks, Chris. And so another question might be quite relevant for quite a few MGA businesses. For smaller businesses without IT teams or big IT teams, what do we recommend as priorities to keep the budget and costs down but being compliant?
Yeah, so I think probably, Chris, you're best placed to answer this one again. I know I'm passing a few on, but IT and technical based sort of minimums and, you know, within budget, because it depends on budget, but what would you say the top priorities are, Chris?
I think for a small business, I would focus on just ensuring the end user devices is as protected as they can be. So you know, make sure encryption is enabled, make sure you've got adequate antivirus malware protection that keeps itself up to date. And when you do use file storage solutions such as OneDrive or Google Drive, etc., make sure the whole business use the same solution so they can keep data in one place. And yeah, I mean, if they want to be certified, then I would start off with like Cyber Essentials, which is a basic set of controls that helps you tick the best practice boxes. And then if more budget allows, then you might look at Cyber Essentials Plus or ISO 27001.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
And so to just move on in a second, so just a reminder, if you've got any questions, if you just go to the chat function and either select everyone in meeting and send your question, or you can select the MGAA or Ian Sutcliffe and they'll come directly through to us. Okay, I will move on to the next slide. So back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Ian. Now we are going to get more into our world of investigations and the data security solutions we at the Copsll Group have implemented. Obviously, collecting personal information is part of conducting any investigation and is our core business. To make the process of securing all this information easier, we keep the places where we store all this data to an absolute minimum and integrate solutions with each other where possible. Let's take a look at a few things we had in place pre-COVID-19 that we rely on heavily during this current testing period. So our remote working arrangement. So GFRS, the Copsll Group, adopted the Google Beyond Corp model in 2019. It allows all our users to access our applications from anywhere in a secure way without the need for a VPN. Google's context-aware proxy conducts several checks when a user tries to access one of our web applications, and only after all the criteria is met will access to the applications be authorized. Users log into the applications using their Google Work credentials and two-factor authentication, which is enabled by default. Here's an example of some of the checks that the Google context-aware proxy checks for. So when a user signs into the system, it checks whether their device is company issued. It checks whether it's encrypted. It checks whether screen lock is configured on device. And it also checks whether the user is part of the correct security group that allows them to access the particular application. This solution makes it easy for our users to work remotely because it doesn't matter where they're working from. As long as the policy criteria is met, they can access our applications and it is secure. Then video conferencing and video interviews. We use the InView video conferencing solution to conduct all our interviews online. We conduct around 400 interviews using this platform every day. InView has been developed from the ground up with security in mind, and it holds certifications ISO 27001 and a SOC 2 Type 2 certification. All the data is stored on Amazon Web Services, following industry standards and best practices. Measures such as encryption while in transit and at rest and in-depth information and event management controls ensures the highest level of data security. The solution and all of its data is stored within the European Union and it is GDPR compliant. InView has all the usual functionality other video conferencing solutions offer, but features we find particularly useful in the investigation space is the ability to share documents during the call and the ability for both parties to annotate on screen, and this works on any device. In our use case, we use annotation daily to discuss accident or public liability scenes while screen sharing the scene using Google Maps. Everything can be recorded during the call, so it's valuable evidence that we can then pass on to our clients. E-signatures, as you can imagine, we secure a lot of statements. Gone are the days when a wet signature is a common solution. It's all digital now. We utilize a solution called Alpha Trust to sign witness statements or any other documentation. We use the solution as we had complete control over the branding and where we could host the solution. We can host it in our own environment, which we know is secure. We were also able to integrate the solution into our case management system using its API. The solution complies with a multitude of standards, and more importantly, it's court compliant. Then our surveillance data, so statements, photo reports, and surveillance logs, it's all completed on our employees' mobile devices. The surveillance operatives update their logs throughout the day, and either by typing the text or dictating into their device. And every log entry and statement is transferred to our back office system once completed. All the data is encrypted at rest on the device and during transit. We also utilize a service from Egress to make our surveillance footage available for client viewing over the web. Egress protects data in transit and at rest, and all their data is stored in the UK. Egress is certified by the CSG and also holds ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials Plus certification. I'll now pass you back to Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So just to check back on the learning points, hopefully we've today highlighted some priority areas to focus on. So we've covered the COVID-19 position, its impact on data security, the top associated data risks, some solutions to mitigate those risks, and I've given examples of how we are managing the specific risks we face in the insurance investigation world. So in our experience, good cybersecurity and data breach prevention comes from understanding and dealing with the priorities. With the right approach, organisations can enable new work patterns, while at the same time ensuring that security is not compromised and the user's actions do not lead to a serious breach. So can we now move to the final summary slide, please? Thank you. So to recap, our summary points are: home working is here to stay. There will likely be increased home working post-COVID. Understand and be clear on the risks your business faces. Implement solutions using a risk-based strategy and deal with priorities. Increase level of communication and support to remote users in particular. Invest in new technology where possible to make the job easier. Secure your remote devices, as this is where there is the highest risk. Secure video conferencing and related files. And finally, don't relax standards. So I hope that sharing some of our practices, systems and insights has been helpful to you today. And on behalf of the speakers, thank you very much for your time. That's now the end of the presentation, and I'll hand over to Ian to manage any further questions. So thank you once again.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you to Chris and Rob also. So just restarting my video there. A couple more questions. Rob, you might want to either answer these or point to Chris or Jamie. The first one is a reference to encryption. Where do you need encryption deployed as a minimum within the system infrastructure?
It sounds like a technical one for Chris or Jamie. Do you want, either of you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, so I would definitely add encryption to everything that's in transit. So with web applications, that's fairly simple. You just have to apply SSL certificate for all web traffic. Yeah, you also have to make sure secure ciphers is enabled, and all legacy ciphers is turned off. So yeah, secure web traffic in transit, and then also encrypt your end user devices, because as I say, encryption now comes standard with all popular, almost common operating systems. So there's no reason not to enable it. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Another question here. Are there any monitoring systems that can protect against people releasing data from personal devices? I think most businesses have remote monitoring in place to identify where somebody might download, database or a spreadsheet or something from a company laptop, for example. Is there anything that we can protect against where we're asking either in the short term, or we balance the risk of them using a personal device?
Yeah, so there are a number of systems in place, and we have some in place ourselves. Technical aspects, Chris, perhaps just give a couple of examples there, if you can.
Yeah, so you still need some application on the end user device in order to monitor the traffic and then stop it where applicable. So yeah, there's a range of solutions out there. I know one that will be fairly implemented on end user devices on personal machines is a solution from Sophos. So they do a Sophos cloud version, and they've got various features. One of them is DLP, so you can stop people from copying to removal media. You can stop people from uploading files to solutions like OneDrive, but allow them to download things from OneDrive. Yeah, there's a range of controls that you can set up on these software solutions. Zscaler is also a very popular one, but it's quite expensive, so that's probably not aimed at small businesses or personal devices. But yeah, Sophos is probably the most accessible one for personal use.
I think companies have got a choice there, Ian, in terms of making company employees aware of those device monitoring systems or not. It depends on company policy, but we'd advocate a very open, transparent communication process about what you're doing, A, to prevent, and B, from an open trust perspective in making sure that people are aware that this is about protecting the business and the data that you're managing.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Rob. One final question, I think, and unless there are any more come through in the next sort of 30 seconds or so. There's been mention of a few different accreditations. Are there any accreditations that are a legal requirement? For first point to that question. Second point, are there any accreditations that businesses should really think about having, if only to demonstrate to their client base that they take data security seriously?
Yeah, so the accreditations aren't legal requirements. They're adopted standards. And I think Chris has mentioned the sort of starting base point at Cyber Essentials, then moving on to Plus, and then 27001. So I think that's the escalation process depending on investment and time. Unless you want to add anything else to that, Chris, in terms of accreditations, the good ones.
No, that's spot on, Rob. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. Just make sure I don't have any other questions. We have a couple of thank yous in from delegates. I know it's data security, quite a dry topic, so not much humour in it. But it is.
Couldn't rustle up any jokes, I'm afraid.
I know. It's absolutely critical, particularly now, and it's sort of become. It's always been very important, but it's absolutely critical given the speed at which most businesses have had to remove their people from office environments and get them working at home. And there's obviously a lot of risk had to be taken, certainly in the short term, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But I think, as Chris alluded to earlier on, whilst you might not have been able to test some of the data security in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks, it is critical that you do find time to test your security and put any fixes in place as quickly as possible. And hopefully Rob, Chris and Jamie have been able to give you a pretty good idea of the types of solutions that are available out there. So just like to thank all three of them, obviously experts in their subjects, so thank you very much. Also like to thank Ben and the team at the MGAA for hosting the session. And thank you to everybody for joining. I hope you found it of interest. If there are any questions afterwards, feel free to get in touch and ask. We're more than happy to answer any questions going forward. So thank you all very much, and have a good day and enjoy your weekend. Thank you all.